The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for joining us for this webinar on how to reduce staff costs without job losses with Anita Wynne from Beststart HR. Now, Anita has a long history in HR and is also well versed in the ELT industry in the UK. So she works with several of our member centres already, even sitting on the board of one. So I know you're in good hands. I'm just going to go through a couple of things for the webinar itself. We are recording the webinar, so once the webinar is finished you will receive a link so you or your colleagues can view it again as many times as you like. On Thursday, Anita is giving a further talk. She will give you some information about this. I know some of you have signed up. If you haven't signed up, you better find the links on our website. Please sign up for that one as well. It's free, same time, Thursday afternoon. I will leave you with Anita while she runs through the presentation slides. We're going to turn off the webcam, which, I won't be here anyway, but I'm sure it'd be a good thing if I disappear for a bit. We will be taking some questions. Some people have sent in questions. We'll be dealing with those at the end. Anita might ask you if you have any questions during the session, in which case, if you look on the right of your screen along the control panel, you should find a questions box and you'll be able to interact there. So with that, say thanks to Anita.
Thank you.
We're going to turn the webcam off and leave you with the presentation slides.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much indeed, Tom. Thank you for the introduction. To give you a little bit more background on my experience to make sure that you're happy, that you're in safe pair of hands, I've been working in human resources now for over 25 years and have every single grey hair to prove it, I promise. I'm the founder of an organisation called Beststart HR, and we've now been going 9 years. And we provide a broad range of HR services to organisations, including, as Tom mentioned, many English language schools, who either don't have their own dedicated HR team, or for some of those larger organisations, we provide that extra pair of hands. In particular, we provide some specialist services, such as consulting projects on areas such as restructures, performance management, and changes to terms and conditions. So some of the things we've been talking about, or we will be talking about later today, and again then on Thursday, we've been working with many organisations on, in particular, over the last few years. So we currently, as I mentioned, work with a range of schools, and I think it's safe to say all of the ones we're working with are continuing to face the challenges that are very much alive in the industry today. I certainly don't need to tell yourselves that none of us really can have failed to notice how much student numbers are down across the board. And this has been happening now for the last 2 to 3 years. And I guess rather than improving, as one might expect, having seen previous cycles similar to this, the situation appears to be getting worse rather than better. Again, I don't intend to have to go through it. You guys are living it, but we're all aware of that perfect storm which has created the situation. So we've had a relatively strong pound. Well, that was until Brexit, so at least there was one positive element that's come out of that recently. But also we've seen the commoditisation of some of our general English courses, heavy discounts and pressure by ETOs, to name a few. And the lack of that apparent imminent upturn suggests that the changes we are now seeing require a more significant shift in our overall business strategies, together of course with maybe some short-term emergency action, rather than possibly some of the strategies we've seen in clients today, which is a case of holding on in there for that light at the end of the tunnel, which unfortunately just doesn't appear to be coming at the moment. Many schools, in my experience, simply don't have the financial reserves necessarily to protect themselves from sustaining long periods of losses. So the wise ones are definitely not putting their heads in the sand and are starting to look at not only how do we address our business model, how do we recover those sales levels that we're looking for, but also looking at the other side of that profit equation. What can we do to reduce our cost base, both in the short term, but also medium and long term, to help us to secure that future? So with schools being part of that UK service industry that we hear so much about, for most of you, your largest or possibly second largest cost, depending on your buildings, will definitely be staff. So as Tom mentioned, this is the first webinar of a two-part series looking at what you can do, what schools can realistically do to reduce the costs related to staff. The first one today, we're going to be looking at what can be done without having to have job losses. And the second one on Thursday, we'll consider the employment law surrounding how to make redundancies, what the redundancy process might look like, and how we can implement a redundancy process which will reduce the impact on all staff, in particular those who you want to remain in post the job losses scenario, so looking at survivor syndrome. So what are we going to be looking at today? Well, today we are going to be exploring a range of mechanisms that we can use to reduce costs to the business, to the school, associated with having staff. So we're going to be looking at how we can examine all our people-related processes and what we can do there to reduce cost. We're going to be talking about using layoffs and short-term working. This is something that some of you may be familiar with, others less so, but we'll be talking about what that is and whether or not it is a plausible way of you reducing cost in the short term. We're also going to be looking at the hot topic of how you can change an employee's terms and conditions of employment, and also reviewing and reducing contractual and non-contractual employee or staff benefits. As you probably gathered from that agenda, there's an awful lot of information that we're going to be going through. I can't do everything in detail, and also it's very specific to each school, each centre. So I'm going to be looking really at helping you to identify the opportunities. Where should you start? What are some of the things you could be looking at, and what you should be doing once you put the phone down after this webinar to try and look at some of these things. However, I would urge you, once you've decided on what those opportunities are for you, that you do get some specific advice or talk through the specifics of your centre or school. My contact details are at the end. More than happy to have conversations, or others of you may have relationships with lawyers that you've got entrenched, whatever. The point is about making sure you get appropriate advice for your centre and your school. As I mentioned earlier, these two webinars shouldn't really be seen as an either or option. Some of you I know have already registered for the second one, but definitely a combined approach to this problem. So making some changes to staff costs is likely to reduce the need for as many job losses, but we probably need to look at both options in order to increase your school's strength to survive in the longer term. Now, as Tom mentioned, we've already had some questions submitted. Some are very relevant to what we're talking about today, some less so, but I'm going to do my best to answer all of those. However, I know what it's like as I'm talking. Things will be popping up in your mind, thoughts, ideas, questions. So please feel free, as they come to you, record them in that box on the right-hand side in the control panel under questions. If I see one pop up that's exceptionally relevant to what we're talking about, I'll try and answer it as I go along. If not, the plan is that I've left plenty of time at the end. Tom's going to rejoin us, and he'll host a Q&A session at the end, trying to go through all of those questions with you. An alternative, if you've got questions which are very specific to your school or centre, again, you'll find my contact details right at the end. Drop me an email, pick up the phone, more than happy to have a quick chat to help point you in the right direction. So, enough about the intro, let's get diving in. As we mentioned, we've got an awful lot to talk about today. So the first thing we're going to look at is reviewing people-related processes. Now, when we talk about reducing staff cost, the first thing that usually springs to mind, the first expense, is the salary bill. So most of us, most members of senior management, when they think about how do I reduce staff costs, the first thing is how do I reduce the salary bill? And reducing salaries for existing staff, if they're going to continue to perform the same role that they've been doing with you for a long time, so you may have a trainer on a particular salary. If you suddenly want them to carry on training those same things, but you're thinking, oh, I'd like them to work for a salary that's 25% less, let me tell you that's an extremely difficult process to do. And fundamentally, in practice, the real only option is to reduce staff numbers or to look at a restructure, and we will be looking at that on Thursday. However, there are other staff-related costs which we can focus on and which we can get considerable reductions in on top of the salary bill. So the slide in front of you details some of them that you might want to think about. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, we don't have the time to look at every single one of them individually in enough detail for it to be useful for you. So I picked 2 or 3 to have a look at in real detail to give you some real guidance. However, again, if there's a particular topic that's on that slide that I don't cover that you think, that sounds interesting, please put up a question as we go through, or drop me a line. I'm happy to talk you through all of them. So the one we're going to look at first of all, which is the one that often gets missed, is looking at absence. So with only 2/5 of organisations monitoring the cost of absence and the average cost of absence per employee per year being on average £554, there is usually considerable opportunity to reduce costs related to sickness absence in most organisations. Now, often when I raise this with most clients, they will sit back and go, oh, I don't have an absence problem. No, we don't have a sickness problem here. And my first step is to actually ask them, do you actually capture, record all absence consistently across the organisation? And it surprises me that many organisations don't actually do that. So my question is, how do you know you've got a problem or not if we don't actually know who's off and when they're off? Or we know when they're off in the teaching staff, for example, because all of a sudden we know we've got a classroom without a teacher. But we don't necessarily record the information in detail for those areas outside of teaching. So the first step for anybody who reviewing absence as a cost-saving exercise is to ensure that we capture all absence, we record it, and then we measure it accurately across the whole organisation. And this means we can identify whether there is a problem, and if there is a problem, what that problem actually is. It also means that we can handle people consistently to avoid discrimination. Many clients are really wary of touching sickness absence because they're worried about claims of discrimination. But actually, as long as we apply a consistent process to all staff, no absence is untouchable. So what sort of problems might we come across? Well, first of all, we might have a generally high level of absence right across your whole organisation compared to benchmarks, and we'll talk about what a benchmark is shortly. It could be that you've got just a number of individuals who have short-term persistent problems, or it may be that you've got a group of individuals who have a pattern of absence, so Monday-itis, Friday-itis, when their football team are playing at home-itis, and actually if you do a little bit of delving down, you can see quite a regular pattern there. Or it may be that you have a few long-term sickness issues which you feel that you can't touch or can't address. Each type of problem I've mentioned there has a different solution, but none of them are untouchable. And through introducing some or a few of the things that are on the screen here means that you can have quite a large impact on the cost of absence to your organisation. So let's first of all talk about, I mentioned there, about a problem where you may across the board feel that you've got quite a high level of absence compared to normal. Well, the first question I usually get asked is, what is normal? How do I know whether my absence in my school is higher or lower than any other organisation? The most common benchmark that's used is an annual survey that's performed by the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, the CIPD, and they publish that, and it's open to all organisations. It's not just members of the CIPD. If we have a look at their survey for 2015, which is the last one that's been published, I'll expect one coming out in the next month for 2016, The average level of sickness is 6.9 days per employee per year. And that takes into account both private and public sector organisations. Unfortunately, they don't have a private sector education specific one, but the public sector education benchmark is 8.8 days, so slightly higher than the private sector one. So fundamentally, any individual in your organisation who has a sickness level over 6.9 days should be dealt with, should be spoken to. Because what you're saying is that they are more unwell than the average person. And as an employer, you have every right to expect employees to attend work as frequently as an average employer. So what should we do? Well, I'm not talking about getting heavy-handed to start with. Usually the first thing is to identify everybody who has absence over that particular level and have an informal chat with them. Talk to them about the fact that you've identified this, see if they've got any particular health issues, if there's any support they need. And in my experience, for those, I like this term, malingerers, or those who like their duvet days, or they think that their sickness entitlement is an extension to their holidays, this is enough. One small chat to say, I've spotted it, will be enough to have a fundamental impact on their sickness absence. And in every case I've dealt with, within the next 2 to 3 months, you will see a significant decrease in that type of absence. It's purely about a conversation. There will be those slightly more persistent individuals who either for a health reason or just because they've got used to it, where that won't be enough. And then you'll be looking at possibly undertaking more formal processes through the disciplinary process. Now, I usually, for short-term persistent absence, would recommend using the disciplinary process and disciplining people for unreliability. Goes back to say we're not questioning the genuineness of these people's absence. We appreciate that. But instead we're saying, as an employer, I have the right to expect you to be as reliable as the average person. And therefore, when you're not, I have the ability in order to take you through a formal process to try and improve that level. The plus point of reliability as well means that I can also wrap into their short lateness, people finishing work early, taking extended lunch breaks, phoning up at the last minute looking for holiday. So anything to do with reliability, I can wrap it in under one. So generally a conversation is enough, but we need to be prepared for those individuals where it isn't enough to do something a little bit more formal. We could also look at broad measures such as introducing return to work interviews. These don't actually have to be an interview per se, they've just got that title. It can be a short form or a very short catch up with their line manager, which is done after every single time they are absent, irrespective of the duration, so a day, a week, 2 weeks. But again, this can be very effective in identifying those individuals where the absence may not be entirely genuine, or where it's very genuine and actually there are workplace issues which may be causing that you can then address and help the individual. The one thing that's really important with return to work interviews is that they must be applied consistently across the organisation to avoid any claims of discrimination. So if we're always focusing on one particular area, or more importantly one particular person, then we might get ourselves into trouble. So everything we're talking about here should be applied consistently across the school. We also need to touch on those people with long-term sickness problems, and these can cost organisations large sums of money, or also those with either short or medium-term mental health problems. These can be tackled, although the process is very different from the one I talked about, and we do need to exercise some caution because some long-term illnesses are covered under the Disability Discrimination Act, now wrapped into the Equality Act 2010. But the general message I want to leave you with is that no absence is untouchable, and as an employer you have every right to expect employees to attend work as often as the average person, albeit with some reasonable adjustments here and there, and that this area, if addressed, can have a high impact on the level of cost that might be associated with it. So we've obviously got the cost of sickness pay, and in my experience many schools offer relatively generous levels of sickness pay. So clearly if we reduce that, we're going to reduce that cost. But it also can help address reductions in productivity. Every time someone's sick, you've either got to provide temporary cover, or you might also be asking other people to do more work, so therefore they're less productive or focused on things that you may not want them to be focused on. So there are lots of ways that actually addressing absence can help reduce cost. Okay, let's move on and talk about another area, which is flexible working. We're going to be looking at this in just a sort of a high-level area. Many of you may be aware that since June 2014, all staff have been able to request flexible working. So you may remember that prior to that, people with children or who had caring responsibilities could ask for flexible working. Well, actually now all staff have the ability to do that. Now, for most organisations and most schools I work with, that hasn't been a welcome introduction. And I'm quite used to many of my clients groaning when they receive a request as yet more admin and goodness me, how am I going to make that work? However, I'd like to suggest that in circumstances when you are looking to reduce costs, a flexible working request could be an absolute godsend if we deal with it in a positive way. So it's absolutely perfectly acceptable as one of a range of measures to cut costs that you as an organisation, as a school, asks employees to step forward if they would like to consider moving to a flexible working arrangement. And in particular, you might be thinking about part-time or job share. If this is positioned amongst a broad range of measures, it can often be very popular and seen as quite a positive way by staff of avoiding having to make redundancies or job losses. Now, this should be offered to either all staff or all staff of a particular group. So you don't have to say to everybody, guys, we're looking at reducing staff costs. Is there anybody out there who's been thinking about who might possibly want to consider reducing their hours or doing a job share? If actually you know you're really short-staffed in some areas and overstaffed in others. It doesn't have to be to all staff, but if you are going to offer it to a particular group, say all teachers or all client services or all front of house, you should offer it to everyone in that particular group to avoid claims of discrimination. So unfortunately we can't pick that one slightly awkward employee and speak to them and them only, despite the fact that I know you'd love to. We would need to speak to everybody in a particular group. Also, when requests are received, they should be considered against some consistent criteria, because just because you've asked for this and requests are made, you don't have to accept them all. But you might want to say, actually we've received 4 requests, we can't accept all 4, but actually we'd like to accept these 2, and we're accepting these 2 because of these reasons. Arrangements can be trialled for up to 3 months if that would help to allow you to see if that would work. You don't have to accept them straight out, or you can accept them as permanent, whatever works for you and both parties. But whatever you do, the arrangement should be confirmed in writing. And this has worked exceptionally well in some of the schools I've worked with, where we've found that actually people, particularly those maybe later in their career, have actually welcomed the opportunity to step down to 4 days or 3 days and work alongside other people. And it's been a very successful way of reducing cost. I'm going to quickly touch on outsourcing now, which is, if I can get the slides to work. Oh, there we go, outsourcing. This has been a concept that's been around for a number of decades now, and to be honest with you, has had mixed success and mixed levels of popularity. And in fact, as well as outsource now being in the dictionary, insourcing is now in the dictionary, where particularly things like call centres or customer care centres are being brought back in-house, where it hasn't been tremendously successful. But fundamentally, outsourcing is where an organisation, a school, decides to use another organisation to provide specific services rather than them doing it internally. And the classic areas that considering outsourcing are really those non-core support services. Some of those are on the slide at the moment. So things like payroll, bookkeeping, front of house, cleaning, facilities, IT is the very, very popular one at the moment. So as well as being a cost-saving mechanism, as normally the outsourcer can provide similar activities far more efficiently, maximising on economies of scale or minimising downtime, there are also other benefits and savings that can apply. So it allows your school, you can focus on what you do really well, which is education, while you can also get savings in IT infrastructure. So for example, payroll and bookkeeping, you may be paying an annual subscription or an annual license for a particular piece of accounting software. Well, if you outsource to an outside agency, you'll no longer need that piece of software. So not only will you get your payroll or your bookkeeping probably done cheaper than you would be able to do it internally, you've also not got to pay for pieces of software that you don't anywhere need. And also you're likely to have access to very skilled professionals who can do things far quicker or again use economies of scale. The levels, I like to try and provide quantifiable targets when I do these type of webinars. So the levels of savings you're likely to make, I'd love to be able to say, oh, expect a level of saving of this. Unfortunately, it's really difficult to estimate because it depends on so many factors. However, as long as you project manage the outsourcing really well, SLAs are clearly defined, then there'll definitely be savings. Now, sometimes this does have an impact on staff numbers. So, for example, if you outsource your IT services, you may not need your in-house IT function, and therefore you will need to think about staff reductions, or there may even be TUPE transfer involved. So these are things for another day. Log in on Thursday, we can talk about how you make the staff reductions. But what I want to say to you here is nothing should be untouchable. What I'd like you to do is look at your organisation and think, if I was setting up a school tomorrow, brand new, from scratch in the current market, what would it look like? And then what can I do to get my existing structure to look something like what that ideal structure would be? And this is often a good way of doing it. Okay, let's move on. Outside of looking at reviewing HR processes, and again, as I mentioned, if anyone wants to talk about any of those in particular, please contact me later or raise a question. But let's move on and look at layoffs and short-time working. Now, the word layoff, or being laid off, is often a slang term that is used for being made redundant. However, that is not what a layoff actually is. A layoff is actually a legal expression for a particular act which you as an employer can take, which reduces your workforce temporarily. So the expression that we say, oh, I've been laid off, actually doesn't mean they've lost their job. That is a redundancy. Layoffs and short-time working were really common in the 1970s and very common particularly in manufacturing industries, but they came to their fore again in the more recent recession. And what they are, layoffs and short-term working are used when you want to temporarily reduce your workforce, because today, tomorrow, the next day, you don't actually have enough work for them to do, but you are really confident that in the near future, so next week, the week after that, work levels will increase, and you want to maintain those experienced staff that you've been working with for years and years. So it enables you just for a short period of time to reduce your staffing levels whilst maintaining employment and maintaining your relationship with your employees. So let's look at the difference between them. A layoff is when you tell some, and you can select staff or all staff, and I hope none of our schools are in that position, to remain at home for a period of time greater than 1 day. This can be in blocks, so I might speak to staff and lay them off today and ask them not to come back to work for another week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. or it can be reducing the working week to, say, 3 days. So I'm actually laying them off tomorrow and the next day, but I want them back in on Friday. Short-time working is where you reduce staff's contractual hours each day. So let's say we've got everyone on a 7.5-hour working day, but actually you've only got enough students to offer sessions in the morning, so you reduce people's working days from 9 till 5:30 to 9 till 2 over a period of time. So layoffs is where you ask people to remain at home for entire periods of time, greater than 1 day. Short-time working is where you reduce contractual hours, but both are temporary mechanisms. They are potent methods of reducing cost, as you can imagine, but only if you've got clauses in your contract of employment which will allow you to do this and allow you to do this on an unpaid basis. So the very first thing I want you to do before you start getting excited about layoffs and short-term working is to go and have a look in your contracts of employment and to see if you've got a clause that allows you to do this. They tend to hide themselves. People don't necessarily seem to be aware of these, and it's amazing how many clients go, no, I haven't got one of those. And then I have a look and they have got one of those, it's just hidden in amongst something else. So please go and have a look in your contract of employment or any other documents that you've got that are contractually binding, which for some of you could be employee handbooks. If you don't have one, then you can go to sleep for the next 2 minutes, because it's unlikely that you'll be able to usefully use this technique going forward in order to reduce costs. However, what I would say is, if you then in the future look at changing terms and conditions, introducing these clauses can be a well worthwhile exercise. So for those of you who do have a clause, you then need to decide for which roles you want to implement this. Now, it doesn't have to apply to all staff. It rarely does, to be honest. But if, for example, you need fewer teaching staff, you do need to be careful when deciding which staff you're going to lay off or which staff you're going to offer short-term working to, and which ones you might retain on their normal working arrangements. The process, the selection process in terms of doing that must be fair, must be defendable, and must be non-discriminatory. So unless there are clear criteria for selection, then you may need to reduce, say, all teacher staff working hours and using short-time working rather than layoffs. But as long as we can identify specific criteria, it is okay to apply this to small groups of staff. Staff who are laid off and are then unpaid by yourselves for the days that they are laid off or the hours that they are under short-term working may be entitled to something called a statutory guarantee payment from yourself. This will depend on their qualifying conditions. Before you start worrying, guarantee pay is very, very low. It's limited to a maximum of 5 days in any period of 3 months, and the daily amount is subject to an upper limit, which is currently £26 a day. So if you lay somebody off, you may be, if they meet certain qualifying conditions, liable to pay them a guarantee payment of £26 a day for 5 days in any 3-month period. On days when a guarantee payment isn't payable, employees might be able to claim other government benefits, and they are still accruing things like holiday and those sorts of things for you. Layoffs and short-term working can last for relatively long periods of time, and although they are designed as temporary measures, I have seen them work for up to 3 or 4 months at any one time. However, an employee who is laid off or put on short-term working for 4 consecutive weeks or 6 non-consecutive weeks with any 13-week period can give you written notice that he or she wishes to be made redundant. And if they do make that request, you're obliged to either bring them back into work or you're obliged to make them redundant and go through the normal redundancy process. As with much of what we've been discussing today, the key to implementing this successfully is going to be communication to everybody, and about how you could actually communicate this positively to staff. You need to communicate with staff or their representatives as early as possible. You need to explain the rationale for implementing this, is often seen as a measure, though, to avoid redundancies, and as that, it can often be seen as a positive thing. Letters should be given to employees explaining the arrangements, what happens to their pay, what their rights are, and then keeping in regular communication throughout that period is really, really important. So again, if this is an area you're thinking of doing, I've given you a very small overlay here, but do please get some additional advice. But it can be a really effective measure of getting you over a short-term fix. The hot topic at the moment, changes to terms and conditions, and I know this is something that many of you will be very much interested in, although me saying that, it's probably the trickiest of all the areas we're going to look at today. Especially if you've got a good number of long-serving employees, it is likely that you've probably got terms and conditions of employment which were fit for purpose 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, but actually in the current market and looking at how things have changed, they're no longer necessarily competitive, or they've been enhanced in an uncoordinated manner. So you've got some people on one type of condition and some people on another. So I'm talking here about things like overtime arrangements. That's both the rate at which you pay overtime, the time at which it kicks in, arrangements in terms of things like paying for preparation time, administration time for teachers, occupational sickness pay, holiday levels. All of these can become quite out of date and or uncompetitive in an organisation that is currently facing the challenges we are today. So this is the case with you. We can change them. Can we change them and bring them up to date into the current market? And the short answer to that is yes, we can, but it isn't quite as simple as making a unilateral change across the board. It is doable. But before I talk about how we do it, I want to give you a little bit of background so you can understand why we need to tread relatively carefully. So a contract in law is an agreement between two parties, and it's entirely enforceable by law through the courts. An employment contract is absolutely no different to any other contract that you undertake. It's a contract to provide a service, and it comes into effect when an employee agrees to work and they turn up for work and they perform work, and in return you agree to pay them. So as long as that situation is occurring, you have people turning up for work and you're paying them and taking tax from them through the PAYE scheme, you have an employment contract. The terms of that contract are the rights and obligations which bind you as the employer and the employee to that particular contract. And there are three types of terms that apply to that contract of employment. So first of all, we can talk about express terms. These are the ones that are explicitly agreed between the employer and the employee, and they can be in writing or in orally. So for example, the hours of work or the salary that somebody's going to pay. So they are expressly outlined in the contract. There are also implied terms, and they may not be spelled out, but they are the sorts of things that would be generally considered to be common sense. So, for example, it is common sense to suggest that employees must not steal from their employers. We don't need to actually write that in the contract. That is considered to be an implied term. On the reverse, it is an implied term that you as the employer will keep your employees safe and not ask them to do anything illegally. And then finally, the other term are statutory obligations. So, for example, notice periods are governed by statutory obligations. Now, these terms may be documented in a range of documents. We might have a contract of employment. We may sometimes have contractual terms in handbooks. And also, in some cases, they're not documented, but are considered to be terms of employment because of custom and practice. You'll be surprised how many clients I still work with, you'll be pleased, not in the school sector, who don't have employment contracts. But still, there will be some things that may be there through custom and practice. Now, as with all contracts, the terms of those contracts can only be legally varied if you have agreement by both parties. So changes may be agreed either individually, so employer and employee individually, or through some form of collective agreement with a group of employees, and they should always be confirmed in writing. So we can make changes to an employee's terms and conditions of employment. The golden rule is we need to get agreement. We can do it without, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but I would really suggest you err on the side of caution. So in some cases, you might find in your contract, when you go and have a look at it, it may contain some express terms which allows you as the employer to make changes to your employee's terms and conditions of employment. And that flexibility clause, though, can be quite specific, or it might give you some general power to allow you to change those contractual terms. However, it is worth pointing out that it's dangerous to rely on that solely to enforce or make unilateral changes without consultation and without agreement, because tribunals will tend to look at those clauses very, very tightly. So with this in mind, what do we need to do? So the first step is to identify what changes to terms and conditions of employment we wish to make and who we wish it to apply to. You don't need to make changes to everybody across the board. You can select groups of staff to make those changes to. What you can't do is pick individual employees, or it's harder to deal with particular individual employees. And we'll talk about that. Was one of the questions that's been raised, and we'll answer that properly at the end. So once we've identified the terms and conditions of employment we'd like to change, the first step is to consult with all staff affected, either doing it individually, in a group, or through staff representatives. Employees are far more likely to accept the changes if they can understand the reasons behind them and have an opportunity to express their views and feel that those have been considered. It's also highly recommended that this is set within a larger context, so it can be seen as a mechanism to save jobs rather than you as a senior leadership team trying to disadvantage workers. So I would always recommend that you're as transparent and as open with employees as possible, and really explain the background to why you're making this proposed change. You then need to consult with them meaningfully. There is no legally prescribed period for how long you need to do that, although 30 days is considered to be generally good practice, so a month. And you having a documented timetable for this process is key to preventing it dragging on and becoming a distraction. So we've all heard about changes to terms and conditions consultation with railways, for example, that seems to go on for years and years and years, and just means that our delays are longer and longer and longer. So when we open up consultation, I'm always really clear about how long that consultation is going to last for and the window in which people have got to raise their concerns and their issues. Now, it also may be appropriate to offer incentives to encourage employees to agree to the changes, so either maybe a buyout or an exchange of one benefit for another. So if you might be thinking about reducing holiday entitlement, what you might do is increase the number of weeks unpaid leave that is allowed to be taken, or the periods at which time can be taken. So I might reduce my holiday entitlement, but I say actually people can now take 3 weeks leave, whereas before they only took 2 weeks. So sometimes it's a buyout, sometimes it's exchanging one benefit for another. Obviously this should be viewed with some level of caution, because your fundamental aim is to try and reduce costs, and you don't want to get yourself into a position where you've suddenly increased your costs, even if it is only in the short term, and create yourself cash flow problems. But there has been some recent case law which has suggested that some sort of benefit, usually financial in nature, does need to be given to an employee in exchange for their agreeing to new terms to make them entirely safe. That is still sitting out there as a possible maybe, and the case in question was particularly looking at restrictive covenants rather than changing terms and conditions in a situation to avoid job losses. But it is something that you need to bear in mind and think about. So once agreement has been reached, so we've done the consultation and we haven't actually got anybody disagreeing that, you then need to provide notice before the actual change takes place. And again, there's no legal prescribed period. However, best practice suggests using the same level of notice as you would do for terminating a contract. So if you generally have got staff with under 4 years service and they're contractually obliged for 1 month notice, then you could give 1 month notice to this change. If you've got lots of staff who have got long years of service, and we're looking here at 1 week of notice for each completed year of service up to 12, then you could be more realistically looking at 3 months notice. So we've done 30 days consultation, then we've agreed we're going to go ahead and make these changes, and then we give them notice until the change actually happens. The next question I always get when I'm saying this is, well, what happens if they won't agree? To be honest with you, in the vast majority of cases, you will get agreement. It isn't always easy. There will be conflict. There will be some unpleasant conversations that have to happen. But generally, if you've communicated properly, you've positioned it properly around this is a means of us avoiding job losses or avoiding, even in the worst case scenarios, actually shutting down sections of a particular school, you can normally reluctantly get agreement. But okay, what happens if you can't? If you can't get agreement, you can actually serve notice to terminate their existing contract. It's called terminating for some other substantial reason, and then you offer the employee re-engagement on the new terms, on the new contract. This should be considered as last resort only, because in effect what you're doing is dismissing the employee, and you have to follow a full dismissal process. And clearly, therefore, you're opening them up to being able to make a claim to an employment tribunal for unfair dismissal. And it will be entirely down to that employment tribunal to decide whether that dismissal was fair. So you can do it. That's what the government is suggesting they're going to be doing with doctors at the moment, but it should be at last resort. And in my experience, we rarely get to that position. So last one, quickly, to run through, which is really a subsection of the previous issue, changing terms and conditions, is really looking at employee benefits. Some employee benefits will be contractual, whether they're expressed or implied terms, and these are things like pensions, life assurance, holidays, etc. And if you wish to remove these or change the level of that benefit, then you're going to need to follow the process we've just talked about, because in effect you're changing a contractual term and condition. However, I'd also encourage you to consider softer benefits that you may provide to staff. Now, these may have been provided in times gone by as nice to have or to create a great culture, but in times of hardship, these are the first things that you should be looking at. So, for example, catering. That could be providing free lunches or subsidised lunches. It could be providing refreshments such as fruit, cakes, etc. It could be around providing training support and covering costs for expensive courses. And although these may not be contractual terms, changes to them should still be handled in the same manner. So we're still talking about announcement, consultation, notice, implementation. Okay. We've covered a lot, and I can see there are some questions there, so I want to make sure I've left some time for questions. And we've, as I said, on some of those areas, we've really only scratched the surface. So what should you be doing next? When you log off this call, what do I want you to be doing? What I want you to be doing is, first of all, setting up a multidisciplinary project team. This really should include members of your senior leadership team that cover a wide range of disciplines, so finance, teaching, sales, so that all the suggestions that you might be looking at will be considered from all angles. Don't get too big a team, as it tends to slow things down, but I'd really encourage you to get a team of people together who are really going to take this forward. No area should be left unconsidered or to be considered to be out of bounds. Even if a change is quickly rejected due to you looking at the amount of effort it's going to take compared to the benefit you're going to achieve, or you decide that actually it would have too big an impact on your client experience or your culture, everything should be on that table to be considered. You need to set yourself some measurable targets so that you can either who's going to do what, by when, and so that you can actually measure the savings that you're making. This could be really important if later down the line you need to be making some job losses, you can demonstrate what you've already been able to do. And finally, that goes without saying, communicate, communicate, communicate. Our staff know that the market's difficult. They can't really have missed it, to be honest. And so starting communication early, start painting that picture, outlining the areas you're thinking about, asking them to come up with some ideas and things for you. All of those things will help you to be transparent and will likely to get those the things bought into. And finally, get advice as well to make sure that we ensure that what you're doing is appropriate to your particular setting. Thank you for bearing with that very whistle-stop tour of some of the topics we're looking at. Tom is joining us now, so I'm just going to put the camera back on for us to deal with questions.
Right, thank you, Anita. Thanks very much. Very interesting stuff, and I hope that was useful. Now, I did send you an email. We did have a few questions in via email, so we're going to cover those first, and then we'll try and get through some of the questions that have come in during the webinar. Time is a bit tight, so bear with us. So the first question we had was, can we target cost reductions to particular staff in a section or department in a way that avoids being perceived as discriminatory? I noticed you covered that slightly in one of your slides, because there's a subsection to that, I think, which also came out in your presentation, which was also how might you target cost reductions to individual underperformers?
Yeah. So I'd almost challenge you, whether you want to make staff reductions or not, would be to ensure that you tackle underperformance. So that is almost comes out of this process, and really you should be looking at every underperformer and tackling them through your capability process. Sometimes people go, oh, do we have to? It takes a long time. But you can tackle underperformers quickly. You should use your capability process, and absolutely you should be tackling those individuals. Looking at the more general things that we've talked about today, it is absolutely acceptable for you to target particular sections, particular departments. Everything doesn't have to apply to everything across the school, but what you do need to do is ensure you're treating staff in a particular group consistently. So if we want to look at all teaching staff, we look at all teaching staff. We could make that smaller and say all teaching staff who currently do one-to-ones rather than group sessions, that's fine, but then we have to look at everybody who does one-to-ones, not one or two individuals. So underperformance is a different issue entirely. Yes, you must tackle them, but you must do it through a capability process.
Okay, thank you. We had another question, which I've also had in several times during my time at English UK, and this is about the current regulations regarding pay around sleeping in or being on call through the night. And also from questions that I've had in my time at English UK, I think sometimes this is also the particular conditions around being on call and what that might mean from centre to centre.
And I wasn't surprised, although I did when I saw that question, because this is a really, really hot topic at the moment. There was actually a ruling only a few weeks ago on this. That ruling hasn't made it any clearer, unfortunately, than it was before. So this is an area where you will probably need to get specific advice. I am more than happy to take calls afterwards on this topic, but generally the rules go, if somebody needs to be at work on site to perform what you need them to perform, so let's take accommodation and you need somebody to sleep in on that accommodation, then the likelihood is in all cases you will need to pay them. There are some slight rulings about what they're expected to do when they're there. If they left, would they be disciplined? Is there a statutory reason why they should be there? But generally, if they're on site, you will need to pay them. Now for on call, so I am allowing you to go home and you might take the emergency phone home with you to answer any emergency queries, that's a different kettle of fish, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they should be paid their hourly rate when they're at home. It depends on what restrictions you're placing on them when they go home. So if you say you must be on call at home, you mustn't leave your house, you must answer queries from the phone and emails immediately they come in, you must be available to drive in and sort out a problem at the accommodation, the likelihood is you will have to pay them per hour for the time they're on call, because they fundamentally can't do anything else. They can't have a drink, they can't go out with their friends, they've got to be available for you. However, if you say to them, look, you'll be on the emergency call, you don't have to stay at home, as long as you get back to people within an hour, a couple of hours, then in those cases you don't necessarily need to pay them by hour for the period they're on call, and on-call allowance is fine. But as I mentioned, there's some real nuances there. There's been over 6 cases this year on that topic alone. So please pick up the phone, and I'm happy to talk people through their individual questions on that one.
Thank you. The beauty of a case law system, I guess.
Or not.
Okay, and one more question we had in advance was, if you want to collapse all jobs in the company to restructure, changing business needs, etc.
Yep.
Some old positions no longer required, new positions created. Staff moving from one position to the other, can the salary be reduced or should it remain the same?
Okay. So I would first of all encourage whoever raised this to make sure they are tuned in to Thursday, because we'll be covering this. The answer, sir, is it depends. If the job you are offering them, the new position that's created that you are offering them, is deemed under the law to be suitable alternative employment, that means that it is very similar to what they used to do. It has similar levels of reporting, similar levels of status, similar skills and knowledge, then yes, you are required to offer them, you must offer them that as an alternative, and they have the right to stay on their terms and conditions of employment. If it is alternative employment, but not suitable alternative employment, i.e. it's a different job, might have different reporting levels, might have different levels of status, may only cover, say, 25% of someone's old job, it's relatively new, but you're offering them the opportunity to stay within the organisation just to do something differently. In those conditions, they apply for that job based on the new salary for that job. Okay. So it's all around the similarities between what they currently do and what they're going to do. But listen in on Thursday, because we're going to talk about that on Thursday.
Okay, and we've got a few minutes, we've had a few questions in. So, first one, is it possible to rewrite the contract mid-term?
It is possible to negotiate changes to contracts at any point throughout the life cycle, so whether that's mid-term, end of term, as long as you followed the process we talked about. So you can't unilaterally change it, so you have to do your consultation and your notice, but you can do that mid-term, that's absolutely fine. It's all about consultation.
And a sort of similar one, if you offer fixed-term contracts, a series of, can you change the conditions for each fixed term?
Yes, you can, but you do need to remember that a member of staff on a fixed-term contract has discriminatory rights. They are protected under the Equality Act 2010, and therefore they should be receiving the same benefits as an employee on a permanent contract. And if you continue to extend a fixed-term contract, or finish one and offer one straight away after it, in effect the person has continuous service, and after 2 years, in effect, has built up the same rights as a permanent employee. So fixed-term contracts, yes, can be used carefully, and then yes, you can vary from one contract to another, but just be careful about what you're doing.
Okay, thank you. I had a question come in that says there's a member of staff who has better terms and conditions because they used to lead on a particular area of provision that maybe the school doesn't offer anymore. So to change that, would you be picking on him?
No, yes, you can. No, you can definitely work on that, because you're not actually picking on him per se. You are addressing all members of staff who have historic terms and conditions that are out of kilter with everyone else. So in your case, you've got one member of staff, but you might have 2 or 3 who've all got historic terms and conditions. So what you're saying is, we as a school are addressing all individuals who have historic terms and conditions that are out of kilter, and we are presenting to you, we want to bring you in line with that, and use the same process, so consultation, announcement, consultation, notice period. That would not be considered to be discriminatory. What would be considered discriminatory is if you did that to one person on the historic terms and conditions and didn't do it to another. So it's about treating staff, all who have the same characteristic, the same.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And when we talk about the notice period for changing contracts, when does that start? Is it when you broach it with people, or is it after you've had that consultation, or is it after a particular email here or there?
Ideally, you would do announcement, consultation, and then notice of that starts after the consultation. However, particularly if you're looking at having to have a 3-month, a 90-day notice period, which is very long, and then we're now, all of a sudden you've got 30 days, then 90 days, and starting to be 4 months before you're making a thing. You can have the two running concurrently as long as you are really clear that that's what you're doing. So as long as when you say the announcement, we're starting consultation, but we are also giving you notice of this change, you can do it. But you can understand my reservation a little bit here. So if I say to you, Tom, I really want to consult with you on this. We really we want to hear your views and your things. But actually, I'm giving you notice of that change. It makes me as the employer sound like I've already made my mind up and my consultation isn't meaningful. So we need to be cognizant of that. But if you are talking about very long periods, then absolutely you can have them running concurrently.
Okay. And interestingly, I think this probably has to be the last couple for time. We've had 2 questions coming on 0-hour contracts.
So they might.
Can you offer 0-hour contracts to new employees?
Absolutely, yes.
And are there any changes to 0-hour contracts, so they should have a guaranteed number of minimum hours?
No, you don't need to. Quickly on 0 hours contracts, terrible press at the moment for 0-hour contracts. I actually think if you have a well-constructed 0 hours contract, they are an absolute godsend for employers and employees, but it's about being fair. So no, you do not currently need to give a guaranteed number of minimum hours. You can, so you can have pure 0 hours, or you can have minimum hour contracts. They are 2 entirely different things, and you can have both still. I'd love to talk to people about 0 hours contracts. So if anyone on there wants to talk to me more about 0 hours, please send me an email and we can have a chat about it, because it's a really useful tool that, if implemented properly, works really well for everybody, rather than everything you see in the paper at the moment.
Thank you, Anita. Thanks very much. Okay, guys, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. However, I'd like to just say a couple of things before you log off. We have been recording this, so you will receive an email where you can then see the recording. In fact, your colleagues could find my links to sign up to the email, sign up to the register, the webinar, and they will, in fact, it will immediately play the recording. So that will happen in a couple of hours. We collect feedback on everything we do, so if you do find a feedback link in emails from me or from the system, please take a minute to let us know your ratings, comments and ideas for the future. Obviously, we've got the webinar on Thursday. I know lots of you have signed up. If you haven't, please go on our website, find my emails to you. That's free, same time on Thursday. And with that, I'd also like to say you can take Anita's contact details, and please contact Beststart if you'd like to receive their newsletter. I'm signed up to this. I can guarantee you it is light touch. You won't get bombarded. It's very useful information. So please follow the contact details, make contact with Beststart and sign up to their excellent newsletter. Thanks again, Anita.
That's fine, thank you.
I hope that was very useful for you, and I hope to see you on Thursday. Thanks for joining us.
See you then, thank you.